Chapters 26 and 27 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. The Red Rose. He did not see her enter. He did not hear her enter. Yet he knew that she was there, although he had left her across an ocean. Another sense, it seemed, there was within him. He knew that she had crossed the room, that she was leaning, rounded arms all bare, across the back of the great chair by the window. He did not know, he had not looked, yet he could see her, beautiful, gloriously beautiful in her strange, weird, dark beauty, head poised like a tiger lily upon its stalk, great masses of dead black hair coiled in the disorder that, of her, was order above the low, white forehead, vivid lips parted to reveal the gleam of shining teeth, long, lithe limbs in the easy relaxation that is of the panther or the leopard. At length he turned. She was there. She was as he, unseeing, had seen, as he had known that he should see. He had ceased to wonder. The unknown had taught him so much that of the things it had not taught he had ceased to wonder. He looked, and looked away. She laughed, a little lightly. She turned a little, lissomely. He could see the muscles of her straight, slender shape ripple beneath the shimmering black gown. At length he spoke, roughly, gruffly. "Well?" Almost caressingly she answered, "Well?" "So you've come to gaze upon the ruin you have wrought, eh?" Again she laughed. "Upon the ruin we have wrought, my fool," she corrected. "Don't call me that," he muttered. "It hurts. It hurts because it's true." "Most truths hurt," she remarked, smilingly. "Now," he mumbled, "yes." And then, "You're satisfied, I hope. She's gone." "Gone?" It was a pretty inflection, the rising inflection of great surprise. Her eyes, glowing of merriment, belied her lips. "Gone," he repeated, doggedly. "Gone, and taken the child, my child, our child, with her." She glided across to where he sat. She leaned over him. "And you're sorry, I suppose?" she asked mockingly. "Heartbroken?" "Yes, by God, I am!" he cried, from the soul. There came from her lips a peal of merry, musical laughter. "The man of it! Every man wants two women, one to love and one to respect. One to caress, the other to honor. One to please himself, the other to please his friends. And you're no different from the rest that I have known." He looked up at her, eye laden of hate and scorn. "The rest that you have known!" he retorted, with bitterness, with meaning. "The rest that I have known," she returned, evenly, lightly. "Young Parmalee, and Rogers, and Seward Van Dam, and God knows how many more." She laughed. "Jealous, eh? That is as it should be, my fool." She laid her hand lightly on his shoulder. Roughly he took it, casting it from him. "Damn you!" he cried. "Let me alone." She drew up stiffly, but speaking softly, said, "So?" I didn't mean it that way," he apologized. "I wonder if you ever spoke that way to her, the other. You didn't," came from her, slowly. He shook his head. "No," he replied. The woman seated herself upon the arm of his chair, lithely. "And do you know why?" Again he shook his head. "Because you never loved her as you love me. A man is as rough sometimes to the woman he loves as at other times he is sweet." She plucked a scarlet rose from the great cluster that she wore at her breast, dangling it in one white hand lazily, sensuously. "You know well of men, don't you?" Schuyler remarked, bitterly. "Well enough," she replied, lightly. "And that is why when you said, 'Damn you, let me alone,' that I didn't say, 'Damn you.'" She struck him lightly across the face with the scarlet blossom. "And go." Then, with abrupt transition, "That, and because I love you." He laughed, mirthlessly. "Because you love me!" he cried, his voice all scorn. "Because you love me! Does love then bring disgrace, and ruin, and dishonor upon the object of its lavishment? Does it? Does it?" She had sunk upon the floor at his feet. Her legs were drawn beneath her. She poised herself upon her supple white arms, looking up at him. "Sometimes," she returned, evenly. "Even as it brings joy, and ecstasy, and happiness untold. And it does bring that," she purred sibilantly. "Doesn't it, My fool?" He leaned forward, drawing her to him. "You know it!" he cried. "You know it!" She saw beginning to glow in the leaden eyes the light that she alone knew how to kindle. It pleased her. It pleased her also to blight it at her will. She laughed. She knew as well how to blight as how to kindle. She knew also how to twist a soul in torment, and how to swirl it to the false heaven of unreal joys. For she, of the unknown, knew much more, perhaps, than of the known. She said, laughing janglingly, "But you never think, My fool, that there are different loves?" He sunk back into his chair. The eyes again were leaden. His head bent. She leaned forward, taking from a vase on the table a nodding white blossom. "One love," she went on, "is like the white rose, pallid, pale, wistful, weak. A lifeless thing that lies dead against the hand that holds it, that wearies the eye and chills the soul. The other love is like the red rose, rich, rare, glowing, glorious, that thrills the heart with the joy of living, and quickens the blood in the veins until the very soul cries out in the frenzy of its fragrance. A pulsing, throbbing love of body and soul and heart and head, that rushes upon one like a storm at sea, dashing one hither and thither, impotent in its tearing, tossing grip. That is our love, the red love, and it is sweet, is it not, My fool?" She bent over him, watching the light again leap to the heavy eyes as he answered: "Sweet? Sweet as paradise. A false paradise, perhaps, but still paradise. Those days on the Mediterranean, the sea no bluer than the sky that held it in its sunlit hand, and Venice with the great round moon overhead and the mysterious semi darkness all about, the splashing of soft waters there beside us, and the silent whisper of the lazy oar, and just you and I, alone amid all the glories, side by side, heart in heart, soul in soul." With a great choking sob, "It was sweet, lady fair, sweet." The woman continued, "And there are two roads through life, even as there are two roses. The one is a rough road and weary, and on it happiness seldom treads. It is a plodding road, flat and long, and there you walk with stale and barren people through a stale and barren land, until you come to an ending yet more stale and more barren than our road or people. That is the road of the white rose. But the road of the red rose? That's different. On the road of the red rose there is laughter and light and happiness and joy. Flowers bloom. Birds sing. There come the soft wash of the sea, the silent whisper of the breeze, the call of love. She rose lithely to her feet. In one hand she held the bending white blossom, in the other the crimson. Suddenly she thrust them toward him, body bent, lips parted, and cried, sibilantly, "Which rose do you choose, My fool? Which road?" Roughly he struck from her hand the drooping flower of white. That of red was crushed between them as he seized her in his arms and drew her to him. "The red rose," he cried, "and the red road. And we'll travel to the end and beyond." CHAPTER 27 The Red Road From across the table she was laughing at him, brightly, merrily, laughing to see the havoc that she had wrought in the soul of a man. He turned to her, almost savagely. "You do love me, Lady Fair, don't you?" he almost pleaded. "You must love me, knowing as you do all that I have given up for you." He pointed to a heap of carelessly tossed letters upon desk top. "Do you see those?" he demanded. "The first from Washington, the President, demanding my resignation. Following that, curt requests that I withdraw from positions of trust that I held. My wife crushed. My child disgraced. My friends gone. God in heaven! What haven't I given you, Lady Fair?" "I thank you," she responded, most graciously, bending low. "And I have given you what? Myself. Is that less than a fair exchange?" "Not if I may keep that self mine, and mine alone, for all time. But may I?" "Can you doubt it?" she queried, with a lifting of arched brows. "There was Parmalee." "A silly boy. I never cared for him." "And Rogers." "Interesting, only interesting. And only at first. Then tiresome." "And Seward Van Dam." "Next to you, a man," she cried. "But, like you, insanely jealous, and unreasonable." "And in the end, perhaps," he said, slowly, very slowly, "I shall be like him." He sat for a moment, silent. At length he continued: "But if it were to be I alone, for all time, could it last this red love of ours? Could it? Could it?" She leaned forward. "Why not?" she asked, lightly. "Why not?" Leaden eyes were gazing out into nothingness. "Age comes," he said. His voice was low, and deep, and dead. "The body withers. The brain grows dull. The blood becomes thin. The soul gets weary. And the power to live as once we lived is taken from us. We sit white-haired, blue-veined, drinking in the sun through shriveled pores to drive the chill from our shrunken frames. It will come to you, to me, to all of us, and neither man nor God may stop it." There had come to her face an expression as of great fear. This man who knew so little was teaching of that little to her who knew so much. At length she swept that fear from her as one might brush aside the ugly web of a sullen spider. Again she was the woman who did not know the known, but only the unknown. She asked, lightly, "Why worry over the years to come, when the days that are ours? There is happiness in the days that are?" Her voice was very soft. Again dull eyes gleamed. he exclaimed. "Happiness! I did not dream that there could be a happiness like this." Her slender arm was about his neck. He could feel the glow of its warmth. Her voice was soothing, infinitely soothing, and musical beyond the telling. "Then keep a dreaming, my fool," she purred softly. It was almost a whisper. "Keep a dreaming." "Would to God I could," he cried, earnestly. "Would to God I could, forever. The memories of 1,000 joys are with me always. Love? What is this love? A golden leaf of happiness floating on the summer seas of life. A silver star of utter joy set in the soft heavens of eternity. A dream that is a reality. A reality that is a dream. But the storm comes upon the sea. Black clouds blot out the stars, and there can be no dream from which there is no awakening." "Yet," she cajoled, "while the sea smiles, while the star shines, while we dream, there is happiness to pay for all." "To pay for all, and more." Again he turned upon her, swiftly. "Yet in the golden aura of that happiness there always stand 3 sodden souls pointing stark fingers at me in ghoulish glee. Parmalee, Rogers, Van Dam. If I for one moment thought, that I should be as they, I'd—" She stopped him quickly. "You'd what, My fool?" "I'd kill you where you stand," he replied, savagely. She laughed, gaily, clapping soft palms. "That's the way I love you best, My fool. It shows spirit, and manhood, and good red blood red, like our roses." She plucked from her breast a handful of scarlet petals, casting them above her head. They fell about them both, a glowing shower. She went on: "How for a moment you could have imagined that you loved the woman you call wife, a soft, silly, namby-pamby." He was on his feet now, fierce, primal, brutal, all the manhood that was left of him straight and rigid. "Stop!" he commanded. "Don't you dare say one word against her, or by God, I'll—" She interrupted, rising haughtily before him, and said, coldly, incisively: "You forget yourself. You humiliate yourself. You insult me. I'll say what I please, of whom I please." "You'll keep your tongue off her, and off the little one." "I'll not, if I choose not." "You will." She laughed. He stood for a moment, poised in anger. Then the momentary flash of righteous wrath was gone. He turned slowly from her. She remarked, lightly, scornfully: "The man of it! And again the fool of it! You would protect her who has scorned, and flouted, and humiliated you." "The fault was mine," he flashed, "and you know it, and I know it." "Then why did you do it?" He shook his head, eyes again leaden. "God knows," he whispered. She stood for a moment. Then again laughter rippled from the red lips. "But why should we quarrel?" she asked, gently. "There are things in life more sweet." She went to him, leaning toward him, beautiful arms extended, lissome body bent. "A kiss, My fool," she whispered. He turned from her. "No!" he cried. She smiled. "I said, a kiss, My fool," she repeated. "I heard." Her eyes were on him. Slowly he turned. The set jaw relaxed. The straight-limbed lips weakened. He looked at her. Her lips now were almost upon his own. Her eyes were very close to his. Again she whispered, softly, sibilantly, caressingly, "A kiss, My fool!" He thrust her from him. "You devil!" he cried. "I love you, and I hate you. You are beautiful, and you are ugly. You are sweeter than the last of life, and more bitter than the sodden shame of a secret sin." She replied, lightly, arranging the masses of her hair with deft, slender fingers, "All of which is quite as it should be, My fool. For the hate makes the love but the more poignant. The ugliness is but a fair setting for the beauty. The sweetness in bitterness is far more sweet than sweetness alone." Her mood was different now. He had sunk into the great chair. She seated herself upon its arm. Her head sunk to his, her cheek against his, and again he kissed her on the lips. End of chapters 26 and 27. Chapters 28 and 29 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Battle. The car stopped before the porte cochere. Blake alighted. He knew well the way. He did not ring, for the door was unlocked, ajar. Jaw close set, lips but a thin straight line, he made his way down the great, dark, silent hall. He had come to do that which it were hard to do. When one has been the friend of such a man as John Schuyler was, when one has felt toward a man as such a man as John Schuyler must be felt toward, when one has known that man to do the things that he has done, when one has seen the misery, the suffering unutterable that he has caused, the shame beyond depth, the grief beyond measurement, and when she upon whom has been heaped this shame and grief and misery and suffering unutterable is the woman one loves, then it becomes not a little thing to go to that man without murder in one's heart and vengeance in one's soul. Blake knew where he was most likely to find the man that had been his friend. There he went, thrusting open the broad door. He paused upon the threshold. The woman lifted her head. She moved away from Schuyler, arranging the dead black masses of her hair. She laughed a little. Schuyler turned. Eyes again leaden saw Blake. "You!" he cried. Blake said no word. Schuyler laughed raucously. "So you, of all, have not decided to flee from the leper." Blake, looking at him, said slowly, "No, I stay behind and stand the stench for the sake of him who was my friend." "Is the stench then so great that it precludes the common courtesy of announcing your presence?" Blake made no answer to this. "I wish to see you alone," he said, simply. Schuyler half swung from him. "You may see me as I am," he returned, doggedly. "And a most damnably unpleasant sight it is." Schuyler wheeled. "You go too far," he said, threateningly. "Too far?" repeated Blake. "Impossible. I wish to see you alone. If you and this woman dare." She, smiling, bowed graciously. "By all means," she agreed, easily. "No!" cried Schuyler. "Stay where you are." She shook her head. "Pray pardon me. I'll wait in the morning room." Alone, Blake turned and looked at Schuyler. Could it be that this was the man that had been his friend? It must be, and yet how could it be? There was in his heart a great bitterness he could not understand. Schuyler had turned to him. "Look here, Tom," he began doggedly. "Before you begin, I wish to tell you that it is useless. Nothing that you can say will change me in the slightest. I've made up my mind, and my decision is unalterable." "Irrevocable is the word." "As you will. I'm sorry if the course I choose doesn't seem right to you, to the world, sometimes even to myself, and I'll confess to you that it doesn't. But, right or wrong, it's the only one for me, and I must take it. Must, whether I will or not. So, if you've come for a cigar and a chat, well and good. But if for anything else, go and avoid trouble." "I'm looking for trouble," returned Blake, quietly. He advanced to the table and leaned against it. "Jack," he exclaimed, "you're a damned fool. There was some excuse for the others. Parmalee was a kid, Rogers an old fool, Van Dam—well, absinthe and asininity account for him. And they fell to their fooldom without warning to guard them or precedent to shield them. But you, open-eyed, knowing everything, forewarned and forearmed, walk fatuously to your doom as one sheep follows another over a precipice. I swear I can't even yet believe that it isn't all a dream. I keep pinching myself and saying to myself that in the morning I'll wake up and go around and tell old Jack all about it as being a good joke. It's an uncanny, filthy sort of a nightmare as it stands, however." He turned to the other. Schuyler was striding up and down the room. "Old man," he pleaded quietly, "what's the answer?" Schuyler stopped in his walk. Looking at Blake, he remarked, "You've never loved. You couldn't know." "Never loved!" cried Blake, scornfully. "Couldn't know! Hell! You make me tired. What do you mean by debauching and degrading a good, pure word like love by applying it to this snaky, bestial fascination of yours? You're a fool." Schuyler advanced upon him, threateningly. "Don't you call me that, too," he said, tensely. Blake paid no heed. "Love!" he cried, disgustedly. "This sordid, sodden passion of yours love? Love lies only where there is sympathy, and respect, and mutual understanding. Do you mean to tell me that you have any respect for this woman? You know well you haven't a bit more respect for her than she has for you, and that's none. Do you mean to tell me there's any sympathy between you? No more than there is between a snake and a bird. And you aren't capable of understanding her any more than she is of understanding you. Love! It's lust, and you know it." Schuyler had dropped into a chair. Blake finished. He swung toward him. "Go on," he almost hissed through clenched teeth. "Go on. If you can tell me anything that I haven't told myself, I'd like to hear it. Tell me what you think. Tell me what everyone thinks. Put into words the scorn and contempt that I see in every eye that looks into mine, in every mirror that I look into. Go on. Tell me something else. But let me tell you one thing. When Destiny can't get a man any other way, she sends a woman for him. And the woman gets him." Blake looked at him. "A fool there was," he quoted. Schuyler interrupted. "Stop!" he commanded. "Don't you suppose I know that thing by heart, every syllable, every letter of it? Don't you suppose I know what it means, all that it means, better than you can ever know?" He struck his forehead with clenched fist. "Tell me the things that lie here." His voice was almost a scream. "The things that lie here, and burn, and burn, and burn. Tell me the things that lie here." He struck his forehead again. "I'll tell you this," said Blake, voice cold and ringing. "It was written for you by a man who knew you, and you'll listen." "No," protested Schuyler. He started to rise from his chair. But Blake, catching him by the shoulders, thrust him back, holding him pinioned. "You fool!" he remarked bitterly. "You poor, pitiful, puling fool! Honor and faith and a sure intent. A wife, a child, a reputation, a character. Stripped to his foolish hide, the poem reads. But you're stripped to your naked, sodden skeleton. If I weren't so sorry for you, I could cut your throat. When I think of the little girl, calling you daddy, honoring you, loving you, and of what you've done for her. When I think of your wife, of the woman who went through the pains of childbirth for you, who held you sacred in that great, loving, glorious heart of hers, who gave and gave and gave, asking only that there might be the more to give, you say that maybe I don't know what love is? Well, maybe I don't, and maybe I do. There are some things that a man may not tell his best friend. There are some things that a man may not even tell himself. But I'm different from you, thank God, and I love differently." He moved back. Schuyler remained seated. Leaden eyes had in them now a new light, the light of suffering refined. Blake commanded, "Stand up. Look me in the eye as man to man, if you can." Swiftly Schuyler rose to his feet. The two men stood face to face, eye to eye. "Now," cried Blake, hope in his heart, hope ringing in his voice, "will you be a man, or a thing that earth nor heaven nor even hell has room for?" CHAPTER 29. Defeat. Came from the door of the morning room a light, ringing, musical laugh. The woman stood there, white arms extended above her head, hands resting on door sides. Schuyler fell back a step. Blake turned. Again she laughed, lightly, ripplingly. And then, "What a splendid revivalist was lost to the world when your friend became a mere broker." And to Blake, "Why, once or twice I myself became almost enthusiastic. Really, sir, you are a most convincing speaker, though if you will pardon a well-meant criticism, your low tones are a bit harsh." There was in Blake's heart a great bitterness. When first he had come to see the man that had been his friend, there had been in his breast but little hope. Later, however, he had understood better, and there had awakened within him an idea that perhaps, after all, it was not too late. And then had come confidence and the desire to fight. And he had fought. He had almost won. But now he knew that he had lost, for in Schuyler's eyes he saw dull, hopeless docility, and in the woman's, conscious power and strength beyond measure. He turned. He looked at this woman who was his foe, his victor. Slowly he said, "There is supposed to be honor among thieves. Apparently there is none among libertines." He took his hat from where it lay amid the confusion of the table. He bowed, first to the woman, then to Schuyler. He was a proud man, a strong man. It hurt him to lose, and the more because the stake had been so great. He passed across the room and through the door, closing it behind him. Upon the woman, still laughing in the delight of her success, Schuyler rounded. There was in his heart, too, a great bitterness, a great hurt. For he, too, realized how near he had been to salvation, and that realization made the present distance seem yet greater than ever before. And God alone knew how great that was. "I hope you're satisfied," he remarked dully. "Now even he has gone. You've broken the last link that bound me to the life that was." Again she laughed, ringingly, merrily. Then the greatness of his wrath obsessed him. "Laugh!" he cried wildly. "Laugh at your fool, the helpless, spineless, soulless fool who does your bidding even to the depths of hell. Laugh! Laugh!" Suddenly his body seemed to wither. He leaned weakly against the back of the great chair. His head sunk slowly upon his arms. There suddenly came from the stairway a little, delighted cry in childish treble. "Daddy! Daddy, dear!" Schuyler, head buried, thought at first that it was but within himself that he heard, that it was that other sense, that unknown sense, that had called him. The cry came again. Slowly he raised his head and looked. A great cold clutch tore his heart. His veins stiffened. His head reeled. He staggered back, clutching for support at the chair. Even this had come to him. It was she, his daughter, the child of his wife and of himself. The child that had been his to love when still he had been man. The little one was scampering down the stairs, tiny feet pattering upon thick carpet. Her eyes were dancing, her lips smiling. There was in her the great, unequivocating, unquestioning gladness of the young. "Daddy!" she cried again, all delight. "Daddy, dear!" He hesitated. Then swiftly he ran to her, seizing her in eager, thrilling arms, hiding her face against his breast that she might not see. Yet it was too late. "Oh, what a beautiful lady, daddy!" cried the little one. "Who is she?" He gasped. He choked. He could not answer. The woman stood looking on, smiling, still smiling. At length he found words. "How did you come here, little sweetheart?" he asked. "I runned away," she returned. "I was in the park with Mawkins. I left her while she was talking to a policeman. Oh, daddy dear, when are we coming home? I miss you so much." The woman moved forward, eyes upon the kneeling, soul-torn man, and upon the little child that was his. "Another advocate," she said. "It has been skillfully planned." "What does she mean, daddy?" queried the child. He answered quickly, "Nothing, dearie." The woman stepped forward. He hurriedly drew the child from her. Again she smiled, a little. There were some things that she understood, that were of the known. The child was speaking. "And, daddy," she said, "mother dear isn't a bit well. Mawkins and I are dreadfully worried about her." "What's the matter with mother?" he asked quickly. "Tell me." The child shook her head. "She cries most all the time," she replied. "And when I ask her what the matter is, she just shakes her head and says, 'Nothing, dearie. Mother's tired.' But people don't cry because they're tired, do they, daddy?" He did not answer. Head sunk in hands, the bitterness of it all, the awful, ghastly horror of the things that he had done, was obsessing him body and soul and brain and heart. The fires of the uttermost hell were flaring through his very being. Then it was that the woman beckoned to the child of the man that belonged to her. "Come here, dear," she said, voice modulated. The man might not hear yet. The child hesitated. "I'd rather not," she replied. The woman bent forward, swiftly, undulatingly, as a snake strikes. She seized the child, clasping her to her. and once, twice, thrice, she kissed her on the lips. The man awoke. He staggered to his feet. Through the door came Blake. He, too, saw, and while he did not understand all, he understood enough. Across the room he sprang. He tore the child from the now yielding arms of the woman. Holding tight against him the little one that he loved as his own, he turned savagely upon the man who had once been his friend. "To think that any human being could sink so low!" he almost hissed. And he was gone, taking with him the child he loved. It is safe to play with a soul just so far. Sometimes it is safe to play even farther, when one really knows one's strength. The woman had possibly overestimated her prowess, and yet possibly she had not. It were hard to tell of one who knows the things that we do not, who does not know the things that we do. There was manhood, and honor, and decency in Schuyler yet, a little, of a sort. He struck her in the face, full upon the vivid crimson lips, and a little of their crimson seemed to leave its lair. It trickled down upon the dead whiteness of her skin. But she still smiled. Her white arms went forth languorously. Her lithe, slender, beautiful body undulated. Her eyes were on his. She still smiled. Again he struck her. Still she smiled. Her eyes looked into his. He raised his hand to strike again. The hand did not fall. Her eyes were on his, and she still smiled. She gauged her power well. Perhaps at times she flattered it a little, but never much. She still smiled. Perhaps it was that which she desired. It were hard to tell, for, after all... End of chapters 28 and 29. Chapters 30 and 31 of A Fool There Was, by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. And Its Consequences. Blake, leaving the house, lifted Muriel into the big French car and got in beside her. Her little mind was in great puzzlement, and of Blake she began to ask the countless questions that flew to her lips. Why was Daddy living there, when Mother dear and she were with Aunt Elinor? Who was the lady that she had seen, and did he know her? Was Daddy living there all alone, and when was he coming to live with them as he used? And many, many more. Some of them Blake answered as best he could. Others he evaded. His heart ached within him sorely. Almost he wished that he were a woman. The relief of tears would have meant much. With childish, wondering questions stinging deeper and yet more deep, he watched the stream of traffic swirl past. Car and cab, brougham and bus. They were on the Avenue, Fifth Avenue, like which there is no other street in our land. On they went, past great club, past rows of magnificent residences, past towering church and staid old dwelling. They came at length to the plaza, with its hotels and glistening statue. The park lay to the left, a thing of green, with its arching trees. Uniformed nurses were wheeling little perambulators. Others were watching active, tousle-headed little charges. Anon there flashed past a group of galloping riders. At length they turned into a side street. The car stopped before a house of brick and stone, with wrought iron lattices. Blake got out, lifting the child. The butler admitted them. Mrs. Van Vorst was in, he said, in response to Blake's query. Mrs. Schuyler was out. It had been some time since Blake had seen Kathryn. She had been very ill almost unto death. This had followed the receipt of a letter from John Schuyler, a letter which made futile all their efforts to spare her suffering, a letter in which he had been condemned of his own hand. Dr. DeLancey had labored hard and well. In the end she was saved. But Dr. DeLancey was an old man, a very old man, and when he had seen that she was saved, he himself had passed away. Possibly it was as well, for he was a lonely old man, you know. And those few whom he loved had brought him much suffering. It was a strange letter, that letter that had wrought so much, a letter utterly unlike the man who wrote it. It was, in part: God himself only knows how I feel. I can scarce believe that it is I who write. And yet it must be I. There is no such thing as redemption, no such thing as hope, no such thing as palliation or excuse. It is simply an end of me that is not death. Would to God it were. Death would be welcome, even a death of torture refined. There is nothing that I could say that you would understand, for nothing that I could say would I myself understand. It is simply the end. I hope I am insane. Yet I fear that I am not. I am a ship without a rudder. My will is gone from me. I have no volition of my own, no soul, nothing. All that is left of me is a body, and the power still to suffer, and, for the rest, only a great emptiness and a greater pain. Kathryn had fainted when she received that letter. Then fever had come, and with it delirium. Which was merciful. For weeks she lay closer to death than to life. Now she was better, and yet far from well. Violet eyes were sad, dull. Brown gold flesh was pallid. She moved with languor. For weeks no word of all that meant so much was spoken. It was a topic carefully avoided. One day Kathryn had said that she must go to see Schuyler. They had tried to dissuade her, without success. This was to have been the day. So Blake himself had gone, eager to bear for her the shock, should there be a shock to be borne, and, if not, to render easy her going. Elinor met him as he entered the drawing-room. He set the child down, bidding her go find her nurse. Then he turned to Mrs. VanVorst. "I have seen him," he said, simply. She looked the query that there was no need for lips to speak. He shook his head. "It is impossible," he declared. "Quite impossible. She was there." "We must dissuade Kathryn from going, then," said Elinor. He smiled grimly, sadly. "It will not be hard, I fear. Muriel was there, too." And that was why Kathryn Schuyler did not go then to John Schuyler. CHAPTER 31. That Which Men Said. A winter had come and gone. It had been a bitter winter, and a cold. For Kathryn Schuyler had it been a bitter winter indeed. Sick of heart, sick of body, she had stayed in the city, going out not at all, seeing of all her friends only Blake, trying with all her pride, with all her strength, to adjust herself to the new order of things. It had been a weary winter, a winter that dragged along on laggard feet, loitering, waiting. The love of Muriel, the sympathy of Elinor, the devotion of Blake were in it the only bits of brightness. She felt strange, lost, astray. By day she was dull, listless. At night sometimes she slept a little, at others she would bury her face in her tumbled pillow, and her lithe body would heave with the racking of her sobs, for the entire structure of her life had been ruthlessly torn down by the hand of one man. It seemed to her that from its ruin nothing might ever be erected. She told this to Blake one day. Side by side they had been sitting by the window, gazing out into a sleet-swept street, where horses slipped and slid, and hurrying foot-passengers passed with heads buried in collars or furs. He had said but little in reply, merely that there are things in this world that we do not know, and that happiness sometimes comes whence we least expect it. He did not say these things with any great degree of confidence. In his own life there had been but little save longing unsatisfied, prayers ungranted. But she took from it comfort, even though there seemed in it so pitifully little from which comfort might be derived. Perhaps it was the way in which he said it, or perhaps it was because it was he who said it. However, winter at length dragged out its weary life to its weary end. Spring came, and with it the soft green of the new-born grass, and the lighter shoots of crocus and lily, and the buds of the trees. Spring grew, and the stolid phalanx of city homes began to don their summer armor of boards and blinds and shaded windows. And then the Larchmont place was opened. John Schuyler had sent to Kathryn the deed of it. The one request that he had made was that she continue to live there, that she take Muriel there. During all this time no word of him had come to her. Blake had heard, but no word had he said to Kathryn, because of the things that he had heard. A man of the breadth of acquaintance, of the breadth of interests, that was John Schuyler's may not fall to the desuetude unwatchful. And Blake heard at clubs, at theaters, wherever men congregate, of Schuyler, and of the life that was his. And he, as little as they, could explain. Schuyler was drinking, they told him, drinking hard. The woman? Was she still in New York? Yes. She had been seen at the opera. She had been seen driving in the mall. A damnable strange case, the whole thing. Gruesome. And, save Blake, they would wash the taste of it all from their mouths with liquor. Devishly good fellow, Schuyler. Brainy, too. He would have been one of the big men of the country, if it hadn't been for this. A chance to save him? They shook their heads and smiled grimly. You know how it is yourself. When a man gets into the hands of a woman like that, what can you do? Say anything against her, and you have to fight him. Tell him he's a fool, and he tells you to mind your own business. Try to reason with him, then if the man had any reason left in him, there would be no occasion to reason. It's hard, true, but your hands are tied. It's just good-bye, and a prayer for the next man, so they reasoned. And could Blake say that they were wrong? Could you? End of chapters 30 and 31. Chapters 32 and 33 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. In the Garden. Kathryn stood beside the blossom-laden arbor, culling fragrant tender blossoms from the wealth before her. Beside her, Muriel, little skirt upheld, received them. "Mother, dear," said the child at length. "Yes, honey." "Does God make roses?" "Yes, dearie." "Who made God?" Her mother smiled. "He made himself. God makes everything, dearie." With troubled brows the little one asked, Did God sit down when he made his feet?" Came from the house Elinor. She moved lithely, swiftly now. The old tan had come back to her cheek. She was no longer an invalid. "More roses, Kate?" she asked brightly. Kathryn nodded. "Yes," she said. "It seems almost brutal to cut them, doesn't it? But I love them in my room, and they won't grow there." "Then sleep out here. It's quite the thing nowadays." Kathryn smiled a little. "You're so frightfully lacking in sensibilities, Nell." "And," returned her practical sister, "a lot more comfortable because I am." She seated herself. "Tom's back," she announced. A quick little gleam of gladness sprang to the violet eyes. "Is he?" Elinor nodded nonchalantly. "Yes. That floating palace of his dropped anchor about 10 minutes ago. They were lowering a launch as I came downstairs." "Oh!" cried Muriel, excitedly dropping the roses to the lawn. "There he is now. I can hear him winding up his boat." She ran at headlong speed through that arbor way. Another moment and Blake had entered, carrying her in his arms. Kathryn extended her hand to him. He took it in warm, firm, friendly clasp. Elinor nodded. "'Lo, Tom," was her salutation. "'Lo, Nell," he returned. "You're getting fat." "The same to you, and many of 'em," she replied. "Have a good time?" "Oh, the same old see-saw." He shrugged broad shoulders. "This running a sailor's boarding house isn't what it's cracked up to be. We hit a 3-day executive session of a northeast storm off the Banks that kept us exceedingly busy. Every one on board was seasick, except the cook." "Tom," interrupted Kathryn, "I wish you'd come into the library a moment. My lawyers have sent me some papers to sign and return, and I can't make head nor tail of them." "Of course you can't," he said assuringly. "I never know what my lawyers are doing. If I did, I'd fire them and do it myself. And they realize it. A lawyer can order a fried egg cooked on one side only, and make it sound like a royal proclamation announcing a total change of the currency system. They're like doctors and clairvoyants. Their graft lies in being mysterious. Why does a doctor call pink eye mucopuerperal conjunctivitis? Because pink eye is not worth more than $1 at the outside. But when he hands you mucopuerperal conjunctivitis, he can get 25 at least before you wake up and say, 'Where am I?'" His humor, perhaps, was forced. Possibly there was nothing funny in what he said, but they laughed. There was always a tension at Gray Rocks now, always a strain. It needed little to relieve it. It needed that little badly. Blake gave to that little all that he could. Even the child felt the tension and the strain of it. She could not have told what it was, but she missed something beside her daddy. Infinite was her longing for him, and her loneliness without him. At times she used to beg the dignified Roberts to play buck jump and tag with her as daddy used to do. And this she did while Blake and her mother and her Aunt Elinor were in the library, going over the troublesome papers with their imposing seals and undecipherable writing. "I've been looking for you everywhere, Miss Muriel," the butler announced, impressively. Everything that Roberts did was impressive. "Were you, Woberts?" she queried. "You didn't want to play hide-and-go-seek, did you, Woberts? Because if you did, I'd like to, heaps and heaps." He opened his lips in protest, but she interrupted. "I'll be it, Woberts. And you can run and hide. Oh, will you?" What could he say? It hurt his dignity. It was a distinct prostitution of pride, and yet what could he say? What could he do? For he, too, loved, pitied, and was sorry. Thus it was that, returning from the library, Kathryn, Elinor, and Blake came upon a red-faced and puffing butler engaged in giving a most realistic imitation of a bear, while a delighted little girl, clapping tiny hands in glee, adjured him to growl as bears growl, not as cows growl. It was another welcome little break in the tension. And for that it was welcome. Welcome, that is, to all but him of the outraged dignity. And even he, though he puffed and huffed below stairs, deep down in his heart was glad that he had sacrificed his most precious possession in such a cause. Chapter 23 Temptation Elinor Van Vorst swung around in her chair and eyed her sister. "Well, Kate?" she asked. Kate raised violet eyes in protest. "Please, Nell, don't insist," she begged. "I don't want to talk about it." Her sister continued, firmly: "It must be talked of. You must divorce him, Kate." "No." "But I say yes. You should hear what people are saying about you." "What do I care what people are saying about me? It's what I think of myself that counts." "That may be true," her sister retorted. "But it's too idealistic for this world. Moreover, you're not consistent." Kathryn looked up quickly. "What do you mean?" she demanded. Elinor shrugged her shoulders a little, and answered: "You're compromising. You're hedging. If he isn't good enough to live with, he isn't good enough to be married to." "But," Kathryn protested, "I can't live with him, Nell. You know as well as I how impossible that is." "Then," returned Elinor, rising, "divorce him." Kathryn shook her head, wearily. "I can't do that, either." The other turned. "Then what are you going to do?" she demanded. "Are you going on forever being honest neither with him nor with yourself? Compromising on the one hand with your womanhood, on the other with your selfishness? How long has it been since you made the slightest effort to see him, or to send anyone to him?" Kathryn answered slowly: "Not since the time I tried to go, and Tom went before me. I have thought often of going, but somehow I've been afraid." In almost a whisper she repeated: "Yes, afraid." Elinor Van Vorst raised her shoulders in an expressive gesture. It conveyed more plainly than could words that her end of the argument was done. Her case was rested. Kathryn considered long, earnestly, in silence. Divorce him? Divorce John Schuyler? It had occurred to her. It had occurred to her in the long silences of the night. In the thousands of eons that had lain, ofttimes, between the setting of the sun and the rising thereof. Divorce him? It was a thought that stung. He had been to her all that any man could have been. He had been a man of whom her head was proud, and her heart fond with the great love that lies in the heart of a good woman. He it was, and God, who had given her the little child that she could see from where she sat, rolling, a tumbled little heap of white lace and whirling brown legs on the broad expanse of the green lawn. He it was who had taken the first of her life, who had shown her what it was to live. And then this thing had come, this awful, hideous thing that had stretched even her very life to the breaking point, and drained from it the wealth of sweetness to the uttermost drop. She felt resentment, yes, and horror and disgust. Yet there were other things, she knew, though she could not have told how she knew. There was something that was hidden, something unknown and unknowable. Long she thought, and earnestly, as she had thought so many, many times before, times without end. At length she rose. Firm little chin was set. Violet eyes were firm. She said, slowly, "I think I see your point, Nell. You're right." "And you'll divorce him?" Kathryn shook her head. "No," she replied softly. "I'll go to him." Elinor started. "What?" she cried, untrustful of her own ears. "I have failed in my duty. You have shown me wherein I have failed. I'll go to him." Elinor caught her hand. "Kate," she pleaded. "Kate, dear, listen to me. I haven't shown you your duty, if that's what you consider your duty. I'll tell you something that you haven't thought of. Muriel." In almost a gasp her sister cried, "Muriel! Muriel!" "Can you take her with you?" demanded Elinor. Kathryn shook her head. "No," she replied. "Of course not. I shall leave her here with you." Her sister shook her head. "Do you see?" she queried. "Can you go to him and live with him as wife?" Kathryn made no answer. Again Elinor shook her head gently. "Don't you understand?" she asked. "It's compromise on compromise. Hedging on hedging. Can't you see how impossible it all is? How utterly impossible?" Torn of anguish, of inability to solve the problems that God had laid before her, Kathryn turned beseeching eyes to her sister. "But what shall I do, Nell?" she asked, beseechingly. "What can I do? Wasn't it hard enough, even that way?" Elinor replied, gently, "Too hard. I want to make it easier. I want you to leave him, irrevocably. Then you can forget him, but not until then." Kathryn was silent. "What does Tom say?" she asked, at length. She had learned to depend much upon the big-bodied, big-hearted, big-minded friend of late. "I haven't asked him," returned her sister. "But I will, now." She rose quickly, and went to the rose-strewn arbor-way. She could see Blake, out upon the broad lawn, playing with the child that he loved, boyish, natural, whole-souled, with all the enthusiasm unspoiled that God gives not to many who are grown. "Tom!" she called. "Yes," he answered. "Will you come here to us for a moment? Let Muriel stay with Mawkins." "Right-o!" he called, cheerily. In another moment he stood in the opening of the arbor, hair rumpled, clothing awry. "Well?" he asked inquiringly. Elinor began slowly. "Tom, Kate and I have been talking seriously. I want her to leave John Schuyler. Legally leave him. Leave him for all time. It's the only fair, the only right thing to do. I'm not going to argue. It is all sufficiently plain. She can't live with him, and yet, as long as she is his wife, she has no right to be away from him, and she can never go to him. She wants your opinion, Tom," she went on. "She's always respected your judgment more than mine, more than that of any one save the man upon whom she may never depend again." Kathryn had wandered to where the white blooms clustered thickest. She was thinking deeply, bitterly. Elinor drew closer to Blake. "I like you, Tom," she said, softly. "You're a good man, a decent man, a clean man, and they're mighty scarce these days. All that Kate may have owed to John Schuyler she long since paid to the last sad penny. All your life you have been paying things that you did not owe. There is happiness somewhere, a happiness that can be found." She thrust out her hand. "Tell her what to do," she said. "Tell her the right thing to do, the thing that should be done." And she turned on her heel and went away. For a long, long time Blake stood motionless. Of that which was going on within his soul no one might know. The expression of his face remained the same, and of his body. Only his hands clenched, and unclenched, and clenched again. It was a difficult position in which he found himself, how difficult only he might know. There lay before him a vast, spreading vista of golden possibility, a possibility of which he had never dared to think, even to dream. Possibly it were but a possibility, and yet surely it was that. A word from him would so make it. That he knew. On the other hand... For yet a longer time he stood, hands clenching, unclenching, clenching. Slowly he went to where the woman he loved stood, slender white fingers plucking nervously at bending blossoms of fragrant whiteness. She turned a little. Violet eyes slowly lifted. He looked into their depths. His hands clenched and unclenched more swiftly. "Kate," he said at length, slowly, very slowly, "do you want me to tell you what to do?" She answered with infinite weariness, I don't know, Tom. I'm tired, so tired." And then, abruptly, "Tell me, yes, tell me. What shall I do?" She waited, deep eyes lifted, little head poised wearily upon white rounded throat. He answered, very slowly, with effort that even he could not conceal. "Kate, do you remember that day in June, 8 years ago, when you walked down the aisle of Old Trinity? Do you remember how the sun shone in at the windows, flecking the darkness of the old pews with golden motes? John Schuyler met you at the altar, and to him you said, 'For better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part?'" Gently he laid his hand upon her shoulder with great tenderness. "Stick, Kate," he advised softly. "Stick." And that was all. End of chapters 32 and 33. Chapters 34 and 35 of A Fool There Was, by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. The Shroud of a Soul. It had been arranged that Blake, again, was to go to him first. Little had been heard of John Schuyler of late. A drop of desuetude may of its last half be far more silent than of its first. One gathers momentum as one descends, whether the descent be physical or moral. At the inception comes the gradual slipping, the vast, frantic effort to stay that slipping, the exertion, the hysteria, the fright, the remorse, the stretching out of hands to aid and of souls to help. Then things become different. There comes a vast silence. The hands draw back. The souls are hidden. And when hope itself lifts its pinions and soars away, then there be little left indeed. John Schuyler, deserted of friends, deprived of all usefulness in the life that he had loved, found it to be so, and finding, tried to think no more. If only the great God would take from him his brain. But he did not. All were gone from him now, save she, the woman. The doctor came occasionally when summoned by Parks who had known and loved in other days. And the coming of the doctor and of her were the only things that marked the beginning of the days, and the ending thereof. He lived in the study a part of the time in his rooms. The rest of the house knew him not. And the great out of doors, even in its warrenated streets of the city, but seldom. And from the study, at least, all save she were excluded. He had been worse that day, much worse. Parks had stayed indoors all day, listening. As night came on, he had become frightened. The telephone in the hall had been out of order, and he had taken upon himself the liberty of entering the forbidden domain, for the doctor must be called. The door of the library study creaked as he opened it. He opened upon the threshold, aghast. This could not be the same room that he had seen so short a time before. He looked about him in horrified disbelief. Before him there lay the very essence of dirt and disorder. Furniture was broken, overturned. Rugs were askew, wrinkled. The desk, upbearing broken bottles and a cluttered mess of paper, letters and debris of all descriptions, was scratched and dented. Pictures sagged drunkenly upon the walls. Hangings were torn and draggled, and over all lay a pall of dust, dank, choking. Slowly, dreadingly, horror gripped his heart. Parks crossed the room to the desk. He picked up the telephone from where it rested amid the litter and placed the receiver to his ear. The voice of the operator came to him across the wire. "Hello," he called. "Give me 2290 Plaza, please." At length there came to him an answer. He inquired, "Is this Dr. Grinnell's office?" It was the doctor himself. "This is Parks, Mr. Schuyler's secretary. He is worse, much worse. You had better send someone to take care of him. I am going away. Yes, that's all. Good-bye." Hanging up the receiver, Parks sought amid the confusion of the desk for a sheet of paper and envelope. At length he found them, but the pens on the desk were beyond use, and the inkstands dried and dusty. It had taken Parks a long time to come to the decision that he should leave this house. Long and faithfully and well he had served John Schuyler. He had served him gladly, and given of his best. And, until it had come, had he received besides generous pecuniary rewards, the more grateful compensation of pleasant treatment, consideration, good fellowship, friendliness. He could not have cared more for John Schuyler had he been of kin to him. But the disintegration of a man's soul and brain and body is not a pleasant thing to watch. It had come to a place where Parks, in his heart, felt that he could do no more. For the rest, there was nothing to detain him longer. At first Parks, as most, had come to think that the man was innately a libertine, awaiting but the right one to strike the hidden flint and set the tinder aglow, the tinder that would burn and consume and destroy. He had known of men like that, of men who went the even pathway of their lives until there crossed it another who tore them from it. And that one they followed, leaving soul and morals and decency and cleanliness forever behind them. This, at first, he had thought to be John Schuyler. For the woman was beautiful, beautiful as an animal is beautiful. But then he had not been so sure. His confidence had been shaken, for she had looked into his eyes, too, playfully, and he had felt his very being rock upon its foundation, and he had slunk away, chilled, helpless, horror-ridden. After that he had avoided her. She had paid no attention to him. So the anger, the disgust, the resentment that at first he had felt at length been altered to sorrow and grief and pity beyond utterance. Yet there had been nothing that he could do, nothing. He could not sleep of nights. It was killing him, too. Upon the soiled, rumpled sheet he wrote. Came a noise behind him. He looked up, quickly, frightenedly. It was Blake, and quick relief sprang to the clean-cut face. But the horror of it was in Blake's. Even as had Parks's, his eyes wandered dreadingly about the room. The horror of it all was in his soul, too. For a long time he said no word. He only looked. He thrust the curtains aside. The dust, impalpable, strangling, fell about him. "Good God!" he muttered. "Good God in heaven!" He saw Parks. "Has it been like this for long?" he asked. Parks shook his head. "I don't know," he answered. And then, "It must have been. The servants are all gone." "Servants gone?" "Yes, there's been no one below stairs for a fortnight. They irritated him, and he discharged them, one and all." "His valet?" "Went last night. I go to-morrow. To have known him as he was, and then to see him as he is, I couldn't stand it any longer." There was a pause. Blake looked about him. At length he spoke. "Does she come here now?" "Seldom. No one ever comes. It's a lonely place, sir. Frighteningly lonely." "And he?" "Drink, if you will pardon me, and remorse. He seems bent only upon forgetting everything. Try as I will, I can't keep the brandy from him. All day, all night, he drinks, and tries to forget." Blake nodded. "I see." Parks continued. "At first it made him drunk, and he slept. But now it seems only to numb his senses. I hear him all through the night muttering. I hear him cursing himself, cursing everything, everybody. Cursing her, that woman. Then calling to her, calling. It's horrible." Blake again nodded. "I had heard," he said, "but I didn't dream it was as bad as this. It is too late, then, you think? Too late to do anything? I had thought that if we should wait until she was tired, as such things as she must tire sooner or later—" "Too late?" repeated Parks. "It has always been too late. It was too late from the first. I was with him, you know." "Yes, abroad. I had forgotten." Parks exclaimed, almost fiercely, "I wish to God I could. He was a man, sir, a man." Then, in quick transition, "I beg your pardon. But I was very fond of him." He placed the resignation that he had written fair in the center of the desk. He turned to go. Blake called after him, "Are you leaving?" Parks nodded. "Don't you think you'd better stay a little longer? You can help him." Parks shook his head. There was in his voice a great sadness. "No one can help him now. It is too late, too late." Chapter 35 The Thing That Was a Man Schuyler came down the stairs slowly, leaning heavily against the broken balustrade. He laughed a little, wildly, with the mirthless chill that is of a maniac. His knees bent, he staggered, and he laughed again. At first Blake did not know him. Then, knowing, he could not believe that his eyes brought to his brain the truth. This was not John Schuyler. It could not be John Schuyler. It was not possible. John Schuyler was at least a man, not a palsied, pallid, shrunken, shriveled caricature of something that had once been human. John Schuyler had hands. not nerveless, shaking talons. This sunken-eyed, sunken-cheeked, wrinkled thing was not John Schuyler. This thing that crawled, quiveringly, from the loose, pendulous lips of which came mirth that was more bitter to hear than the sobs of a soul condemned. Blake's soul was curdled. His senses were numbed, but still his eyes could look. The ghastly figure stopped in the moonlight, at the landing of the stairs. White, claw-like hand clutched at the drunken curtain and ripped it from its fastenings. The pale light of the moon fell harsh upon it. Blake shut his eyes. When again he looked, the figure was at the desk, fumbling with a key. A drawer screeched in protest. Came from it a rattling as a cadaverous hand drew forth a bottle, and the thing that had been John Schuyler guzzled. It laughed again, then, in hollow, mad glee. It staggered forward. Its hollow eyes fell upon the letter that Parks had left. Clutching fingers unsteadily tore end from envelope, drew letter from covering, and hollow, leaden eyes gazed. Came another wild burst of laughter gone mad. A voice, thick, weak, muffled, weird, said, "Another enveloped insult. From Parks, the good and faithful Parks," dull eyes read. "Your employment has become impossible." The letter fell to the floor. The voice cried, "The rats desert the sinking ship." It chuckled. Wise rats. Sensible rats. And then dead eyes saw the man who stood before him. "You!" They peered like those of a fish. "Good. I'm glad to see you, even though you have come to scorn, and abuse, and hate. It's a lonely hell, this. Lonely." Blake answered, bitterness in his soul. "I did not come because I wanted to. It was to prevent her coming, the wife who loved you, and who, God help her, loves you still. She would make one last effort to save you." Schuyler laughed again. "There's nothing left to save," he chuckled. "I know, but I'll try for her sake." Schuyler lurched into a chair. In ghastly playfulness he looked upon the other. "Try, then," he cackled. "You did so well last time that you've come to try again, eh? Well, you've come too late. Do you remember Parmalee, the boy who killed himself? The boy that I called a fool?" He laughed sardonically. "He's got me now. He, and Van Dam, and Rogers. 3 damned fools scorching in a hole in hell. 'A fool there was,'" he quoted then, stopping, suddenly, he half rose weakly to his feet. "Listen," he cried. There came utter silence. "Did you hear?" he queried, triumphantly. "Did you hear her calling?" It was more than Blake could bear. "Jack!" he cried, tensely. "Jack!" Schuyler rounded on him. "Don't call me that," he said, petulantly. "Call me the Fool." Blake shook his head, in the gripping horror of it all. "It makes me sick," he murmured to himself. "Sick at heart." Schuyler had heard. "It makes me sick, too," he cackled. He pointed to the shattered mirror above the mantel. "Do you see that?" he demanded. "There isn't a whole one in the house. I don't dare to look at myself." Came to Blake's mind now, stricken and racked as it has been, by that which he had seen, a glimmer of hope. He had heard of men like this who had come back to life, to reason. It might be fever and drink. and it might be that the fever could be stayed, the drink conquered. John Schuyler had been a strong man. Surely it could not be that in so short a time he had been dragged to the grave's very edge. Lack of attention, lack of care, lack of medicine and nursing and discipline were probably largely responsible. The man might be awakened, brought to himself. It might be possible. Speculatively, not realizing that he spoke aloud, he asked of himself, "Is there a chance left? Is there one little chance left to save him?" Again Schuyler had heard. "What would be the use?" he queried, dully. The liquor was passing. "What is there left of me to save? I'm a husk, squeezed dry. I'm a memory, a nightmare. They are calling me, young Parmalee, Rogers, Seward Van Dam. I drink to them now even as they drink to me, scorching in their hole in hell." He rose weakly to his feet, raising a dirty glass in which splashed a little amber liquor. Came to Blake the thought that, even though Schuyler could not be redeemed to manhood, he might at least be saved from death, or worse. He might at least be made again into the semblance of that which he had been. He started forward, hands gripping the edge of the desk, face close to Schuyler's own. "Jack," he cried commandingly, "look here, I want to talk to you." Schuyler slumped again into the depths of his chair. He looked up dully. "Yes?" "Listen," Blake demanded. "Listen closely. There's a chance for you yet. We'll take you away somewhere, for a year, 5 years, 10 years. You can change your name, make a new start, build yourself a new character, a new honor. There's still happiness for you, Jack. We'll go and find it. Come, shall we?" Schuyler answered, dully, with the petulance of the mentally unfit. "It's too late, I tell you. Too late." "It's not too late. You'll try. Come." "It's too late, I say," insisted Schuyler, thickly. "She's torn from me everything that makes life worth living. She's taken honor and manhood and self-respect, wife and child and friends, everything but this." He patted the bare bottle before him. And then, "Let's drink," he muttered. Blake sprang forward, desperation overwhelming him. "My God, this is awful!" he exclaimed. "Haven't you a spark of manhood left? No brains? No bowels? Nothing a man can appeal to?" Schuyler repeated, dully, "Give me that bottle." It was then that Blake came to that which he had mentally intended to be a last resort. Deliberately, not in anger, but in the desperation of a strong man who plays his last card for his ultimate stake, he leaned across the table and deliberately struck Schuyler in the face. It was a hard thing to do, but there are things that so demand. Blake knew that if this time he failed to arouse whatever of latent, atrophied manhood there might be in the breast of the other, that never again, probably, would the shriveling brain come within call. So he struck. And, following the staggering form, struck again, flat on the face, with open hand, hard, stinging blows. And with these blows he cried tensely, "If there's any spirit left in you, I'll arouse it. You pitiful thing that was once a man. You made in God's image. Why, there isn't a swine that wouldn't be ashamed to roll in the same gutter with you." With stinging words and stinging blows he pursued the stumbling figure across the room. Schuyler fell. Blake kicked him, sending foot against body heavily. "Get up, you beast!" he ordered. And then, in the horror of it all, in the awful of horror of the hurt of the thing that he was doing, "Great God! Will nothing awaken you?" Schuyler was scrambling weakly to his feet. In dulled eyes there was a little gleam, the little gleam that Blake had tried so hard, so horribly to bring. The slobbering lip had set a little, and the loose, lax jaw. There was there the shadow of the John Schuyler that was. Blake stepped back, gladness in his heart. He had called him back so far. He would call him back the rest. End of chapters 34 and 35.